What is happening in Washington right now does not look like business as usual. It does not look like a clean, functioning separation of powers. It looks like a constitutional system under serious strain. And the strain is real, documented, and still unresolved. Over the past year, Congress and the courts have both pushed back against Donald Trump's use of sweeping economic powers against Canada. And the story of how that pushback unfolded tells you something genuinely important about where American democracy actually stands right now. Here is what actually happened. And unlike the dramatized version circulating online, the real story does not need embellishment. It is remarkable enough on its own. Start with the legal foundation, because that is where the entire fight begins. Trump used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law known as IEEPA, to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, declaring a national emergency on the grounds that Canada was not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl across the northern border. IEEPA was designed to give presidents tools to respond to genuine foreign threats. It had never before been used to impose broad tariffs on a close ally. That legal stretch was what opened the door to everything that followed. The Senate moved first. Senators Tim Kaine, Amy Klobuchar, and Mark Warner introduced a resolution that would terminate the national emergency Trump had declared as the justification for the tariffs. If approved by both chambers, it would cause the IEEPA authorities to lapse entirely, ending the duties on Canadian goods. That resolution passed the Senate in April 2025. The vote on the Canada measure drew a simple majority in the Senate, with 4 Republicans crossing the aisle to support it: Susan Collins of Maine, Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul of Kentucky, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Let that land for a moment. These were not the usual anti-Trump voices. McConnell is the former Senate Majority Leader and one of the most powerful Republican figures in Washington. Rand Paul had built his political identity on executive power skepticism, and they were both willing to put their names on a vote that directly challenged the president's signature economic policy. Paul made his reasoning explicit. These tariffs hit families, farmers, and small businesses the hardest. And in Kentucky, they devastate cornerstone industries like car manufacturing, bourbon, home building, and shipping. Congress must reclaim its constitutional authority and stop this economic overreach before more jobs and industries are destroyed. That is not a Democrat reading from a talking point. That is a Republican senator from a deep red state making a constitutional argument about the limits of presidential power. But here is where the real structure of the fight becomes clear. The Senate resolution went nowhere because the House was a different story entirely. Speaker Mike Johnson had succeeded in blocking the resolution from coming to the House floor by adopting a rule that barred any floor debate on revoking the emergency declaration. That procedural blockade held for months. The Senate could pass resolutions. The House simply refused to consider them. And without both chambers, nothing could reach Trump's desk. Then, in February 2026, the procedural wall cracked. The rule Johnson had put in place expired, and he attempted to pass a new one extending the ban until August. But 3 Republicans, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Don Bacon of Nebraska, and Kevin Kiley of California, joined all Democrats in blocking it. That procedural defeat opened the door to the floor vote that followed. On February 11th, 2026, the House passed a resolution disapproving of Trump's tariffs against Canada. The measure cleared 219 to 201, with 6 Republicans crossing the aisle to support it. The Republicans who voted for the resolution included Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Kevin Kiley of California, Don Bacon of Nebraska, Dan Newhouse of Washington, Jeff Hurd of Colorado, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. Trump's response was immediate and unfiltered. He posted on Truth Social, "Any Republican in the House or the Senate that votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries. The threat was public, personal, and delivered in real time as the votes were being cast. Representative Hurd defended his vote directly. If we normalize broad emergency trade powers today, we should expect that a future president, of either party, will rely on the same authority in ways many of us would strongly oppose. Bacon was equally direct. Article 1 of the Constitution places authority over taxes and tariffs with Congress for a reason, but for too long, we have handed that authority to the executive branch. Now, here is the critical distinction between the fictional narrative and reality. Even if the Senate passed the same measure, and it had the votes to do so, Trump had made clear he would veto it. And the House had not come close to securing the two-thirds majority required to override a veto. Speaker Johnson, even while expressing disappointment at the result, spelled it out plainly: the president has veto power, and there is not a veto-proof majority in either chamber. Many Republicans who privately opposed the tariffs voted against the resolution precisely because, with a veto coming, the symbolic defection would cost them politically without changing anything in practice. That calculation, strategic silence in the face of private disagreement, is itself a revealing picture of how the Republican Party was operating. So Congress had not stopped Trump. Not really. The resolutions were meaningful signals, genuine expressions of bipartisan discontent, documented evidence that the support for his trade war was not as solid as the White House projected. But they were not a break on presidential power. That break came from somewhere else entirely. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Learning Resources, Inker vs. Trump. By a vote of 6-3, the justices struck down the sweeping tariffs Trump had imposed on Canada, China, and Mexico under IEEPA, ruling that the law does not grant the president authority to impose tariffs. The legal reasoning was fundamental and unavoidable. The court emphasized that tariffs are a form of taxation, and that nowhere in IEEPA's detailed list of authorized powers, including words like investigate, block, regulate, nullify, and prohibit, did Congress include the words tariff, duty, tax, or any equivalent language suggesting it had delegated its taxing power to the executive branch. The court began with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Tariffs, the justices stressed, have long been understood as a branch of the taxing power, historically providing the federal government with much of its revenue. The framers gave Congress alone the power to reach into the pockets of the people, and vested no part of that taxing power in the executive branch. This was not a narrow technical ruling. It was a direct statement about the constitutional limits of presidential authority, issued by a court that has often sided with expansive executive power. From a legal and political perspective, the decision reaffirmed the separation of powers between the legislative and executive branches and upheld the basic right granted to Congress by Article 1 over the imposition of taxes, tariffs, and foreign commerce. It represented a relatively rare instance of the court imposing a check on Trump's actions. The economic consequences were immediate and enormous. The government had collected an estimated $166 billion in IEEPA tariffs from more than 330,000 businesses. All of it was required to be refunded. That is not a rounding error. That is a refund obligation of historic scale, spanning hundreds of thousands of American businesses that had been paying a tariff the Supreme Court had now ruled was illegal from the start. Trump did not accept the ruling as a final resolution. Within hours of the decision, the administration issued a new executive order terminating the IEEPA tariffs, while simultaneously invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose a new 10% global tariff for a 150-day period. The legal architecture had been struck down, but the policy impulse behind it, using tariffs as a tool of pressure against trading partners including Canada, had not changed. It had simply been forced to find new legal ground. Several states, led by New York, then sued to block the Section 122 tariffs, opening a new legal front that is likely to eventually reach the Supreme Court as well. Step back and look at the full picture, because what this story actually reveals is more complex and more significant than any version involving a triumphant 74-26 Senate vote, or a prime minister orchestrating an American legislative rebellion from a war room in Ottawa. What it reveals is a constitutional system that pushed back against executive overreach through the slow, grinding, imperfect mechanisms it was actually designed to use. Congressional votes that were meaningful but not decisive. Court challenges that worked through years of litigation before reaching a final ruling, and a handful of lawmakers from both parties who were willing to put their names on the record even when the political cost was real and the practical outcome was uncertain. As one legal commentator put it plainly at the time, Congress should wake up and reclaim its constitutional power to tax. Until that time, Congress' weakness demonstrates the need for a clear decision from the Supreme Court enforcing the Constitution's limits. That clear decision eventually came. But it took over a year of economic disruption, hundreds of billions in tariff collections later ruled illegal, and a Supreme Court ruling to produce it. The story of how Congress and the courts confronted Trump's tariff authority on Canada is not the story of a system working cleanly and decisively. It is the story of a system working slowly, imperfectly, and under enormous political pressure, and still in the end, producing a constitutional reckoning. That outcome deserves to be understood on its own terms, without the fictional packaging, because the real version is consequential enough to stand on its own.